Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a minute or two for people to trickle in. And thanks so much for joining us for this first session in our series of Affordable Housing 101. And we'll just give it one more minute or so. We have a lot of attendees today. All right, well, I'm seeing a critical mass, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. I'm Jeanette Brown. I'm the Senior Director of Public Affairs at SCAMF. Thank you again for joining us today. So this session is the first in a series of webinar sessions we're doing this month. Here in April, we're doing a total of 5 101 trainings on all the elements of affordable housing development and financing. And our first session is the core elements of affordable housing development finance. And we're very pleased to have Ben Creed joining us to teach this session. He's the Senior Housing Finance Consultant at the California Housing Partnership. We will have another session this Thursday at 1 o'clock. All of the series sessions will be at 1 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So keep an eye out for those. We still have capacity for more registrants. If you haven't checked out the rest of those series, we'll post it in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben to get us started with this session.
Okay, thanks, Jeanette. Hi, everybody. Thanks for spending your maybe lunch hour with us. I'm going to share my screen now. And this is my title slide. So yeah, core elements or bare bones basics maybe of affordable housing development financing. Hope this is of some use and interest to the wide variety of folks that we have in attendance today. I'm Ben Creed, Senior Housing Finance Consultant at the California Housing Partnership. I've been in our LA office for about 3.5 years, and before that I was a project manager doing affordable housing development at West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, a nonprofit developer here in LA County. And my colleague Tony has been gracious enough to support this presentation as well. Do you want to introduce yourself, Tony?
Sure. I'm Tony Quad, Housing Finance Consultant at the partnership for about a little over a year now. Before I came to the partnership, I was a senior project manager at Brilliant Corners, and then Community Corporation Santa Monica before that. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. That's a word about us, and we have 2 quick poll questions to get a sense of the of who's joining us in the audience. So Jeanette, Ariana, if you want to share that first poll, or let me know if you want me to do. Oh, there we go. Which best describes your current involvement in affordable housing? Elected officials office, government agency, affordable housing developer, owner operator, market rate housing developer, owner operator, consultant or service provider, policy advocacy or research, something else. Just take a minute for those who aren't grabbing their lunch right now. If you're at your computer, give it a click and let us know who you all are. And to preempt some potential questions that might be asked, the slides and a recording, I believe, will be shared with attendees after the presentation. Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a mix, a plurality from government agencies, but quite a lot from affordable housing developers, consultants, policy advocacy, research, a few folks from elected officials' offices. I'm realizing now I didn't put student, so I wonder if some of the 15% in the audience are students. Thanks for that. And the second question here, how long have you been actively involved in affordable housing? I think I just hit my 7-year mark, if I'm doing the subtraction in my head right. Wow, quite the mix. 41%, 2 years or fewer. but a good 24% 2 to 5 years, 16% 5 to 10 years, and 19% of you over 10 years. I hope that the concepts and the content in this presentation has something for everybody. But at the end, please fill out SCAMP's survey. This is sort of a pilot presentation on our behalf of the partnership. And so we would love to know what worked well and what could be improved. Just a word about our employer, Tony and my employer, the California Housing Partnership. We were created by the legislature in 1988. And we assist the nonprofit and public sectors in affordable housing, development, preservation, and sustainable housing as well for Californians with low incomes. We sort of have a financial consulting department that Tony and I are a part of, and we work directly with nonprofit developers on their projects down in the weeds, as well as providing trainings at the SCAMF conference, Housing California conference, partner trainings, public agency trainings, and things like that. And we've got policy, research, data colleagues, a sustainable housing team. We have a focus on preservation of at-risk affordable housing as well. And I would just say, if you get bored during this presentation, our website, or if you want to check it out later, even better, our website has lots of very rich, visually interesting, some interactive reports and tools. Our research is very frequently quoted in LA Times, Cal Matters. And those of us who are in the weeds on projects, I think that our work is really benefited by our sort of higher level, macro level, policy research level colleagues. And I think they would say the same thing about us and having our sort of downstream perspective on the actual effect on projects of a lot of these policies and funding programs that they work on. So today, this is similar to the little agenda that you may have seen in the registration link. It's always important to talk about what we are meaning by affordable housing, because it can mean different things in different contexts. And so once we've gotten on the same page about that, we're going to look at a very, very basic, maybe overly basic, overly simplified rental housing financial model. And in order to compare that to what happens, what changes when the units are restricted at affordable levels for low-income households. Spoiler alert, it needs public subsidy. And so we're going to talk about some of the public subsidy programs that are available for projects in LA. So to dive right in, what is meant by affordable housing? Well, in an informal, just conversational context, it's just two words. It's affordable, it's housing, and this can be subjective. And you might think that a certain car is affordable, or someone else might think that a certain restaurant is unaffordable, and the same language can apply to housing. In a policy context, it gets a little bit more specific. Generally speaking, in most policy contexts, housing that costs up to 30% of the income of the household that lives in it is considered affordable, just as a matter of sort of household budgeting. Very often when we say affordable housing, when we hear affordable housing, there is another element involved, which is affordable housing for whom? We're not normally interested in affordable housing for multi-millionaires. We're interested in affordable housing typically for low income or very low income households. Sometimes in very high cost areas, there's an interest in, affordable housing for middle income, moderate income, median income households as well. But quite often, if there isn't further context given, if you hear politicians talk about it or government representatives, you're quite often talking about housing that is affordable specifically to low income households. And there's even a third layer that is often implied under the term affordable housing. And that is when the housing doesn't just happen to be affordable to low-income households costing 30% or less of their income, but it's required when that housing is legally required to rent or to cost that much money, and it's required to be leased exclusively to people who meet low-income eligibility requirements. And so I find that it helps to put sort of real dollars on this. In 2022, which is the most recent year that area median incomes were published for, in LA County, the median income for a one-person household was $84,000, and for a four-person household was $120,000. Median, meaning half of folks in LA County are making more than this, and half are making less than this. And if we use that 30% rule, I'm using rent here for shorthand, but the monthly housing costs for this household, in order to be affordable, that would be $2,100 a month for the median one-person household, $3,000 a month for the median four-person household. And these are rough numbers, and they're rounded for simplicity on this table, but this is the basic concept. Depending on how recently you looked for an apartment in LA County, $2,100. There's a lot of apartments that rent for a lot more than that, but there's a lot that rent for less than that as well. This median one-person household, they'll be able to find something. And the four-person household, they probably need a 2-bed or a 3-bed unit. They might not have their first choice of everything they want in their home, but if they need to, they can probably find something for $3,000 that would be considered affordable under this policy definition. And so that term low income from the previous slide, it's typically defined as 80% of median income, or 20% less than the median income. So it's $66,000 for an individual, or at $96,000 for the four-person household. Now this 30% rule is saying that the budget would be $1,650 a month, $2,400 a month for the 2 or the 3-bedroom unit. Now it's getting a little bit harder to find the type of housing that these households might want. And at the very low income level, half of median income, 50% of AMI, $42,000 for an individual. Now at $1,050 rent, you might start having to make some sacrifices. For 4 people living off of $60,000 a year, $1,500 a month, that's going to be tough to find a 2-bed or a 3-bedroom unit. A lot of these households are going to be making sacrifices in terms of location, in terms of the size, or the proximity to a park, or if it's in the neighborhood that they grew up in and they want to stay in that neighborhood. And they might be making sacrifices in terms of their budget. They might be paying more than this $1,500, more than 30% of their income. The term for that is rent burdened, when a household is paying more than that sort of affordable limit of 30% of their income. And finally, the extremely low income level is typically defined as 30% of area median. And so at $24,000 a year for an individual, $36,000 a year for a household of 4, forget about finding affordable housing for this studio 1-bed or for the 2 or the 3-bedroom unit, $600 a month, $900 a month. The rent is basically going to be higher than that, and it's probably not going to be exactly the housing these households would prefer to have. So that's looking at affordable rents as a function of incomes. Let's look for a minute at incomes as a function of the current average market rents, or at least current as of October. According to Zumper, the average asking rents for new apartments on the market. So if you're looking at apartments in October 2022, you can see the average rents. Let's take studios, $1,750 a month. That's actually affordable. That's actually 30% of a below median income, $70,000. You're paying 30% of your income to afford this average studio. That equates to 83% of area median income. So this is just a hair over the low income designation. If you were a very low income household, though, meaning making half of the median income as an individual, to live in this $1,750 studio, you'd be paying half of your income just towards the rent, the housing costs, with only half of your income left over. Skipping down to the 3-bedroom, on average in October, the average asking rent for 3 bedrooms in LA County, $4,550 a month. That's not affordable unless this 4-person household is making $182,000 a year, or 52% higher than the median 4-person household. And again, to use that very low income as an example, at 50% of the median, a household making that much money would have to spend 91% of their entire income to afford this $4,550 3-bedroom unit. So only 9% of their income would be left. And so there's a clear mismatch here between what is available on the market and what the needs of low, very low, and certainly extremely low income LA County residents are. So returning to our definitions of what affordable housing means in this context and today, and primarily the affordable housing that Tony and I and those of us at the partnership work on, it is specifically concerned with housing that is required to cost up to 30% or less of a low-income household's income. So that's what's meant here by affordable housing. So now that we're on the same page, looking at a very, very basic housing finance model as a baseline to compare affordable housing and how the numbers change. If we imagine a 50-unit building, so maybe 5 to 7 stories tall with 7 to 10 apartments per floor, rent per unit per month, $4,000. That was roughly in between the average 2-bed and 3-bed units from October, from that Zumper data. Operating expenses per year, this is property management, the maintenance and repairs and cleaning, security, property taxes, insurance, all the stuff that it takes to own and operate a building, common area utilities, or if the landlord pays the water bill for the 50 apartments. $6,000 per unit per year. I think that might be realistic for a market rate development. $400,000 per unit to develop it. I think that's plausible. I'm sure there are more expensive market rate developments, and depending on the cost of land, just because LA County is so big and land costs vary so much by location, I think that this might be plausible. Not a market rate not a market rate housing development expert over here. And this is my first note of many on the bottom of our slides here. These are oversimplified hypothetical numbers just to illustrate concepts here. Please do not go off and start a market rate development company using these numbers as your business plan. But the point here is that in this potential hypothetical development, we're going to look at how does this rent and these expenses and these upfront development costs, how do these all interplay to make it financially feasible, so that we then have a base case to compare affordable housing to. This $4,000 unit, just to underscore the point, this ain't affordable housing. This is not affordable unless the household is making $160,000 a year or more. So for a 4-person household, that's 33% above the median. If you were a median income 4-person household, you'd be paying 40% of your entire income to afford this unit, so you would be rent burdened. If you were low income, making 80% of median, you'd be paying half of your income to afford this $4,000 rent. So that would be severely rent burdened is the policy term, when more than half of your income is going to housing costs. And for the very low income and certainly the extremely low income levels, forget it. This $4,000 a month of rent is more than an extremely low income household is even making in a month. But we're going to take this starting point for this hypothetical 50-unit building. And ultimately what this simple apartment building is, it's basically a simple small business. It's got revenue coming in from the rent. It's got bills to pay to keep the building up and running month over month, year over year. And at the end of the day, there's some money left over, 2.1 million in the first year, and a slowly but steadily increasing amount if we assume a certain amount of inflation. Well, it costs $20 million to build this thing up front, and you can't pay your architect, and you can't pay your engineer, and you can't pay your general contractor and the carpenter and your legal and accounting teams. You can't pay them with the promise of a little bit of money once the building is up and running, and a little bit of money the next year, and a little bit of money the year after that. You need to come up with $20 million to build this thing up front before it's collected a single dollar of rent. And so in all likelihood, this developer will need a loan from a lender and an investment from an investor. Lenders and investors, they have long lists of consideration, and it's very different, debt compared to equity, a loan compared to investment. That's not in the scope of today's presentation. But looking just at the dollars, if $20 million is put up to build this, well, those upfront funders have been able to get 2.1 million of that back after 1 year, and another 2.14 million after the second year. And so slowly but surely, they're going to make back that $20 million. It looks here like they're breaking even in year 9, if all of these projections into the future come true. Of course, no one is going to put up $20 million, or no 2 funders will combine to put up $20 million just to have to wait 9 years to get that $20 millionth dollar back. But if they have a 14 or a 15-year or a longer time horizon, this could actually be a really good investment or a, perfectly satisfactory loan for them. If a lender hypothetically were to put up the $20 million and collect every single dollar of this NOI, this net operating income, by the 15th year, they would have gotten 8% interest on that $20 million loan. And if an investor had put up the entire 20 million, it would be an 8% return on their investment. An investor and a lender, again, they have very different risk profiles and they have different benefits that they would get from lending versus investing in the project. The point here is simply that it seems from the numbers like these rents with these expenses for this upfront cost, it might be able to raise the amount of money needed. And if this is true and the rents come in reality lower than projected, those funders might not get the returns that they were expecting. And likewise, if the rents come in higher or the actual operating expenses are consistently lower, then it might be a more profitable venture for everybody that was involved. This, though, is the very, very basics of how the sort of operations of the building ties back to the upfront costs. And at its core, it's no different than starting up a restaurant and having to buy a lot of equipment before you've sold any of your food and not making it all back on your first night of business or your first week or your first month or even your first year. If you're going to start a taxi company and buy a fleet of taxis, you're not going to make up those upfront costs for a while, but eventually you need to make it up and then some in order for it to be worth your while and in order for it to be worth your funder's while. So that's the market rate base case. What is different for affordable housing? We're not here because we're interested in $4,000 rents. We're all here because we're interested in affordable rents for low-income households. If we take the very low-income household as the model, I think it was $1,500 was the affordable rent for the four-person household. A couple of things will change right up front: a much lower rent per month. The operating expenses and the upfront development costs will both likely be higher for reasons that we will talk about a bit later. But the short answer is that there's a lot more requirements on affordable housing, both the development and the operations of it. And so this project may need to raise $30 million to get off the ground, and it's going to be collecting $1,500 rent and paying somewhat higher bills once it's in operations. Well, this building might go a long ways, or at least 50 units of the way, towards addressing the affordability crisis. There's a lot of people at the very low income level who are struggling, as we saw, for what's an affordable rent versus what are market rents. We also have a homelessness crisis, and most homeless households are making a lot less than very low income, 50% of median. And so if we assume 30% of median income and affordable rents, for one-person households, I think that was $600 per month. The operating expenses will likely be higher especially if there's a special needs population requirement for this building. Supportive services, among other things, will be required to be more intensive, and that costs more money. For the purposes of the simplified comparison here, we're going to assume that the development costs are basically the same, whether it's very low income or extremely low income on average. So let's take a look at what the differences are in the funding model. Again, here's our familiar market rate development. $4,000 rent at the operating expenses. We think that between a lender or an investor, it seems likely that it could raise the $20 million that it needs. At the very low income level, the first thing we'll notice is that the total income coming into the project is a lot less, just $900,000 compared to $2.4 million. And the operating expenses are a little bit higher. But we have some good news right off the bat. At $1,500 rents, this project can pay its bills. And as long as this projects out over time, assume with some reasonable interest or, inflation assumptions, this building will at least be feasible if we can manage to get it up and running. Our extremely low income case, if the rent is as low as $600 a month, and if the operating expenses are that $8,000 per unit per year, now this project isn't even able to pay all of its bills. We're looking at $40,000 in the red after the first year. And so even if you could wave a magic wand, or you got a $30 million grant from Mackenzie Scott to build this thing up front at no cost, it wouldn't survive financially because it can't pay the property manager and the utility companies and the insurance premiums and everything like that. So this is where the first intervention of public funds or subsidy comes in. Some affordable housing developments need subsidy during operations. We're going to talk in a little more detail about the two major types of subsidy during operations. But if we assume that this project could secure an extra $1,400 of subsidy per unit, per month, month over month, year over year, then suddenly the income is actually not only high enough to pay all of the bills, it's actually high enough to have even more money left over than the very low income case. Still a lot less than the market rate example, but now we're paying our bills and we've got some money left over. And so just like the market rate development can take some of its 2.1 million of net operating income and go to a lender and say, would you like to make me a loan? So can affordable housing development. These are pretty conventional loans. The banks and the lenders, the loan officers, they need to understand affordable housing. But all of the big banks and a lot of medium-sized banks and some community development financial institutions, essentially nonprofit banks, a lot of them do understand affordable housing. And the mechanics of these loans at the core are really the same thing as like a home loan to a household. 15 to 40-year terms. These mortgages are called permanent loans in affordable housing. And just like a mortgage lender won't assume that they'll collect the entirety of the household's income, they'll only collect a portion of it. These permanent lenders will typically use a 15% cushion, depending on the project details, on that net operating income, the money left over after the bills get paid. So for our very low income development that does not have this operating subsidy, the $550,000 left over, they'll use that 15% cushion. And so they'll say, okay, we as the bank will take $475,000 of that per year. And if we can collect that every year for 20 years, every month really, we will make back $5 million plus 7% interest. And so this very low income development using these assumptions might be able to raise a $5 million loan just from a bank, not from public funds or taxpayer dollars or anything like that. And in the extremely low income case, remember when it couldn't even pay its bills, well, then there's no money left over to attract a loan from a lender. But if it's got that rental subsidy, now at $800,000 of leftover rental income of cash flow, the 15% cushion gives you $700,000 for the annual payments. And so if this lender is using the same terms, they want 7% interest and they're looking over a 20-year horizon, they would probably be able to make a $7.5 million loan. And this is the exact same math that a mortgage lender will use. If you Google mortgage calculator and you plug in this amount of payments or budget and this amount of interest and this term, this is roughly the loan principles that you'll get. So great, not only are we paying our bills, but we're able to leverage a loan from a lender. But these buildings cost $30 million to build under our assumptions. And so that is where the second sort of type of public subsidy intervention comes in. Capital upfront funds, subsidy for the development of the building, as opposed to an ongoing basis for that rental or operating subsidy. This is upfront. The very low income building will need $25 million in total to be able to get developed. The extremely low income one, if it's got that rental subsidy, it's leveraging a larger perm loan. And so it should only need $22.5 million upfront to close its gap and be able to get started. And so this is sort of the core math problem in essence. If the rents are required to be affordable to low-income households, some sort of subsidy of this otherwise infeasible financial model will be needed to make it feasible, almost always for the development costs and sometimes even for the operating costs. There is a very long list of ways to achieve this. And I want to make a quick plug for the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, which 4 of its episodes have been about how affordable housing is done in France, in Singapore, in Thailand, and in Vienna. They probably have more examples by now. There's a whole wide range of ways to accomplish this, but by one means or another, and how much of it is public sector funding and how much of it is incentivizing the private sector, and what are the political considerations in the different countries, or even in the US in different states or at different times in our history, ultimately it's all essentially trying to solve the same fundamental math problem. If the rents are required to be restricted below market levels, something has got to prop up the difference. Today in the United States, most, certainly not all, but the largest slice of the pie of new affordable housing is financed by a perm loan, as long as there's enough of that NOI available in the cash flow. The equity from the or an investment from the low income housing tax credit program, which we're going to talk about, and public funds to fill the gap from the city, the county, the state, federal funds, usually a combination of those. And so that's what we're going to jump into in this next section. So the two major categories, subsidy during operations and subsidy for development, or ongoing, or one-time or upfront, capital versus operating. For subsidy during operations, there's really two main flavors. One of which looks at, is there a shortfall because the rent is lower than the operating expenses attributable to the unit? And if so, the operating subsidy, if you have applied for it and been awarded it for your affordable housing development, will make up that difference in that shortfall. Rental subsidy is sort of what that $1,400 was doing in the example slide. For rental subsidy, and the classic example is a Section 8 voucher. The tenant pays 30% of their income, no matter how low that is. And then this subsidy pays a fixed amount of money per month, per month, year over year, for the duration of the contract. We typically see 20-year contracts, although there's other terms. And that total, the $2,000 in the case of our extremely low income example, that's based on fair market rents, which is a federally defined term. It is not highest market rents, and it is quite often a lot lower than asking market rents in a given neighborhood, depending on the market conditions. But it's typically higher in total than what your very low income or low income units will be paying for their sort of 30% of low income rent calculation. And in that example, it was $1,500 a month for the very low income. It was $2,000 a month total between the low affordable tenant payment and the higher $1,400 subsidy premium to reach that $2,000 fair market rent. I think that $2,000 was roughly what the city and the county housing authorities paid for either studios or one bedrooms last year. I forget which. That's where that $2,000 came from. In any case, in one way or another, this is money that is helping prop up an otherwise infeasible cash flow if the development needs it. Subsidy for development, or capital funds, this one-time upfront funding sources. What the low-income housing tax credit program does is it attracts an investor who normally would not have any interest in such a small amount of remaining cash flow after the bills and loan payments get paid. It provides essentially discounts on a tax return, tax credits as well as tax deductions. If an investor puts up many millions of dollars up front to help build the building, and the investor remains on the hook for 10 to 15 years for the project's ongoing compliance with all of the population and other requirements, income requirements, rental requirements, things like that, that the building has committed to in order to qualify for these tax credits. And if there's a compliance issue, the investor will not get their tax credits, and they're going to make sure that the developer corrects any of the errors. It is a little bit more convoluted, a lot more convoluted, for the investor to get money in the form of a credit and a deduction on a future tax return than for them just to get the leftover cash month over month, year over year. But ultimately, whether I give you a $10 bill or a $10 gift card at a supermarket that you go to all the time, or a $10 coupon to use on your next year's Form 1040 on your tax return, one thing is more direct and simple, and the other thing is kind of convoluted and delayed. But ultimately, the effect on your bank account is essentially the same. Your bank account will be $10 higher at the end of the day, whether it's cash or a tax credit or something else. And so that's the value for these investors, to invest in an eligible, qualified project that, if it does what it said it would do on its tax credit application, will get these tax credits that are valuable to an investor, as long as that investor expects to have a lot of federal or sometimes state tax liability that they can use these tax credits against. The tax credit program is designed not to cover the entire cost of a development. And especially in California, in high cost areas and in areas that incentivize lower income and higher needs residents. Even the combination of the tax credit investment and the perm loan is usually not enough to cover the full cost of development. And so the main type of remaining funds that are used, often called gap funds, are typically public agencies, city, county, state, federal funds. And they're typically made in the form of what are called soft loans. So these are not loans with mandatory payments like the permanent loan. The repayments are either deferred or sometimes forgivable. And so it's essentially upfront funds that you can use to develop the building. And there isn't a major repayment due to the public funder for quite some time. Some of these funds come in the form of grants, and a small but not tiny slice come from private philanthropy. But the majority is public soft loans to fill the remaining gap after the loan and the tax credit investment. But one way or another, it's all, at the end of the day, public funds subsidizing this otherwise infeasible financial model. And this alphabet soup will probably look familiar to many folks in the audience. City of LA, County of LA, various state agencies, federal government. There's an enormous amount of funding programs out there. And I wanted to show this list because, on the one hand, they're all quite different from each other, and they all have different rules and regulations and deadlines and websites and the whole nine. But they do have certain characteristics in common. For one thing, certainly for California projects, the vast majority of them are competitive, meaning that there is less money available than there are eligible, qualified projects seeking those funds. And so in that case, you need sort of tiebreakers. You need points that these applications can score in order to be ranked based on what kinds of housing the funder is hoping to incentivize. These incentives, and sometimes even the requirements, are not always aligned. And this is a classic, certainly federal, state, county, city. There's, there may be jurisdictional differences in any number of areas, and affordable housing is no exception to that. But these incentives, and sometimes the requirements, each funding application will have certain requirements or incentives around how low the incomes in your building need to be. They may have population requirements. Some funding programs are specifically for veterans. Some funds are either prioritized for seniors or exclusively for homeless households. Virtually all require, have their own specific requirements for supportive services for the residents. And very often there are basic level requirements and then additional points incentives for experience on the part of the development team or the property management company, the services providers, that kinds of thing, that kind of thing. And quite often requirements and sometimes incentives go along with them for labor standards, environmental standards, design standards on top of whatever the planning and entitlements and land use require, and on top of what the building code requires. Many of these funders will send inspectors during construction, and every single one of them will have minimum annual compliance monitoring, and sometimes more frequent than annual as well. They also usually incentivize, if not require, cost efficiency. So other funds to be in the deal, so that one funder is not over committed or over leveraged on any one particular project. They might want to see other funds already committed, which is an indication that the project might be ready to start construction sooner than if it doesn't have any funds already committed. Lower development costs, it's an inherent incentive. You can get your project started sooner, the less money you need to build it. And reducing the amount of funds you're requesting from the program can sometimes help your score as well. They also all will have maximums either per project or per unit, or sometimes both, in terms of the maximum amount of funds that each source is willing to provide. There's an inherent tension here. Most of these public benefits add cost, either during development or operations or both. And of course, if you are prioritizing cost savings, you may have to do so by cutting some of the public benefits that may also be incentivized here. So affordable housing developers are constantly walking this sort of tightrope or balancing act, or threading this needle between public benefits and cost efficiency. So this market rate development, to go back to our old $4,000 rent friend, we think based on this oversimplified cash flow that it might be able to raise the $20 million that it needs just from conventional for-profit private sources. The very low income building, it's going to need 25 million of public funds. And for a $30 million development, depending on the type of tax credit, that might generate $11 million of tax credit equity of an investment from a tax credit investor. And it wouldn't be uncommon for a 50-unit building of this size, I think, to need 4 million from the city and 3 million from the county and 7 million from the state. And voila, there's your $30 million. This would take minimum 2 years, often more like 3, sometimes 4, maybe even longer, in order to actually apply and get awarded each of these funding sources and apply for the next one and get that awarded, and then bring that to the next funding application and get that awarded. It's one of the many reasons why affordable housing is often more expensive, because from timelines alone, even if this project scored well enough to get awarded these funds on its first try at the city, county, and state, and then tax credit level, it's just inherently a lot of time, and inflation, costs go up, interest rates change, things like that. The extremely low income development, it's got rental subsidy. So that's a funding application that the very low income development didn't need. The rental subsidy is allowing it to get a larger perm loan. And so it only needs that $22.5 million of capital funds. And if it's extremely low income, it might have special needs requirements. So maybe it's eligible for more funds from the city and more funds from one of the state programs. And that might allow it to request a little bit less of state credits, which, depending on the state credit type, less of tax credits, which might make its funding application for tax credits more competitive. But even with $1 million less of tax credit equity, this project might be able to skip the county application entirely, which could be a big benefit to not have to spend the potentially 6 months between deciding you're going to apply to applying to getting the award and then proceeding with it. In any case, again, don't go start a development company from these budgets here, but this is just the basic concept of how funds have to get raised for affordable housing. So bringing it full circle. Affordable housing as a sort of legally required policy program exists because not enough people are served by market rate housing alone. And if this affordable housing is required to be affordable to low-income households, then it won't generate enough money to cover the significant upfront costs to get it built. And depending on the project, it might not even generate enough funds to cover its first-year operating expenses, or maybe it'll be okay for a while, but the expenses will outpace the rental income, the affordable rental income, and eventually it'll be in the red on an operating basis. And so public funds make this public good financially feasible when it otherwise wouldn't be. That is the core elements of affordable housing development. I've seen a very busy Q&A window, and I'm wondering if Tony or if any of our SCAMP friends want to take the reins for a minute, and if there's anything that is worth discussing live.
So one question I was asked a little earlier was, can developers claim shortages like extremely low income payments on the end of year taxation? So under taxes at the end of the year, can they claim those shortages instead of getting subsidy to pay for it? can't they just claim it as a loss under their taxes? Then you're mute.
I was muted. Was the question, can developers do it?
Yeah.
So in the tax credit program, when I mentioned the tax benefits, and I think this is what the question is getting at, the tax credits are just those coupons. The tax credit investor, by virtue of being an investor, becomes a co-owner. And so they are an owner of this real estate. And even if it's paying its bills up front, when you account for other things like depreciation and the types of stuff that you can deduct on tax returns, the sort of sum total of all of that is usually a loss. And so this investor will have an investment in this piece of real estate property that on a tax basis is losing money each year. And so they do get to deduct from their other taxable income however much was lost, however much of losses there were from this affordable housing development. And so that is the sort of the deductions piece, or the other tax benefits piece, in addition to the tax credits. And the investor looks at both of those things because they both have value, because it's negative numbers on their taxable on their taxes owed over the next 10 to 15 years. And they look at the value of both of those things when they're deciding how much money they can put into a project that is eligible for these tax benefits.
Someone in Q&A just wants you to show the funding sources slide again.
Oh, sure. Go back. Yeah. Much more useful than this questions slide.
I mean, there's a question about rental subsidies and that there are not enough vouchers to go around. I think that's just, it's a reality that we're all dealing with in the industry right now. There's just not enough funding, and there's a lot of need all around.
Yeah. Yep.
And Ben, someone asked about operational subsidies and whether the developer gets that all at once or is it over time?
Great question. If it's specifically asking about operating subsidy, I believe that once the project is different programs will work mechanically different ways. I believe that once the project is up and running, there will need to be a sort of documentation of what the actual expenses were compared to the actual rental income, and then that will the difference will get replenished later on. I believe that many programs, I'm thinking of the No Place Like Home COSR, Capitalized Operating Subsidy Reserve. Initially, when that program was new, they required that documentation up front, but that meant that on a monthly basis, the project had to pay these bills with insufficient money to do it. And so I believe that they worked out sort of an upfront advance, and then on a monthly or annual or quarterly kind of basis, that would get trued up. How much the advances may have exceeded or may have fallen short of what really ended up being needed in reality. That's just one program, and they all function on a mechanical basis a little bit differently. The rental subsidy, once the tenant is in and the housing authority has approved everything, the unit as well as the tenant's application, that just comes in every month. And once a year, the tenant's income is recertified. And so their 30% of their income payment will change a little bit, and the rental subsidy payment, the difference, will change accordingly. And of course, every year, rents and voucher payment standards are updated as well. So that'll just be a once a year change in the numbers. But as far as the sequencing, it comes in once a month, once everything is set up.
And on the current slide you have up, someone wanted to clarify why the LIHTC equity investment goes from 11 million to 10 million, and the difference between the VLI and the ELI. Is that just a hypothetical example you're showing?
Thanks. Yeah, it's just hypothetical. There's not like a one-to-one correspondence here. You could have a very low income, an average very low income development with infinite possible funding sources here. It's the same for ELI. The idea that I wanted to show two examples. One of a funding source, in this case, the county, just imaginary, completely disappearing because you don't need it because the other sources can be higher. And then for tax credits, depending on which type of tax credits, there's two different types of federal credits, and then you might also request state credits. Some of these tax credits incentivize a smaller request. You have a greater likelihood of getting the tax credits awarded to the project if you request fewer credits. Federal 4% credits, that's not the case, but federal 9% as well as state credits, you generally have a better shot at getting funded at all if you request fewer. And so what this is just trying to illustrate is that the rental subsidy increasing the perm loan in the extremely low income example and potentially getting more city and state funds allowed county to drop off completely, which is an advantage. And depending on the type of tax credit may allow you to request less tax credits, which depending on the type of tax credit may also be advantageous. But not a direct one-to-one. It's not that ELI will always have less tax credits than BLI.
And someone's also asking, or Tony, did you have one?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I think people are asking for a little bit of clarity, just understanding what a project-based voucher is, and is that the same as Section 8? And how does that all play into helping the financing?
Yeah, so the federal Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, the most commonly popularly understood one is tenant-based vouchers. There's never enough. The oversubscription rate among people who are qualified and even of who apply is pretty devastating. How few people who could be eligible, in contrast to things like food stamps, for example, which is not, or Medicaid, which I don't believe is just artificially fixed at a level lower than eligible households. There's just literally not enough Section 8 vouchers. But those who are qualified, are eligible and essentially get lucky in a lottery, they hold those vouchers as a tenant, and they as a tenant can bring them to apartment buildings for rent. But there are also, in contrast to tenant-based vouchers from the Section 8 Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program, project-based vouchers. And so an affordable housing project can apply to those. And so if this was 100% extremely low income for homeless households, for example, it would probably apply for all 50 units to have a federal Section 8 project-based voucher, which are administered by local public housing agencies, the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County Development Authority, there's a Long Beach Housing Authority, et cetera. But those are just two types. It's the most common type, at least in my experience. Tony, I imagine the same. You're also here in LA, but there are other rental subsidy programs that function in a similar way, but that are not from the federal Section 8 origin.
There's another question here. If you can talk about the different types of restricted rents, what does it mean to have HCD rent versus HUD versus TCAC, and how does that affect everything?
Great question. Wonder if I can skip back to. So these numbers here, they come from the TCAC rent schedules from 2022, which derive directly from HUD data, Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. But what HUD provides is basically it's sort of census and American Community Survey and maybe some other sources of data just on what median incomes are. How that translates to different number of households, of members of a household, and how that translates to how many household members are assumed to live in a 3-bedroom unit or a 4-bedroom unit. There's different methodologies. And so TCAC has the most common set of income and rent schedules, which take that median income number and do various, multiplication and addition on it to come up with income limits and rent limits for every household size up to like 8 or 9 people, I think, and for every apartment size up to 8 or 9 bedrooms or something, or at least 6 or 7 bedrooms. But other jurisdictions may have different methodologies. There is a particular federal versus California difference, not TCAC difference, but HCD in certain cases, City of LA. It's mainly the California Health and Safety Code is where the origin of this difference is from the federal standard. it assumes a slightly different number of household members per bedroom. And so you will sometimes get different income limits and different rents. And so if you get funding sources that use the sort of standard TCAC rents, but then you have some other funding source, or maybe you have like an entitlements bonus, like transit-oriented communities, or a density bonus or a parking reduction in exchange for affordability, some of those income and rent restrictions may use a different table that's based on different math and different formulas. And it is the lowest income restriction that will prevail. And it is the lowest rent restriction that will prevail. So this is one of the many complications, and it's a very easy one to lose track of on a development. So it's really important, especially folks that work in asset management and property management will tell you how important it is to track these sometimes very complicated different rent and income restrictions. For the purposes of this presentation, I didn't even go into the bedroom count thing. I just used 30% of income over here, and that was where I stopped. But rest assured, there is a lot more complexity if you want to go deeper. And I want to make a quick plug for the partnerships trainings. If you are a nonprofit affordable housing provider or a public agency working in affordable housing, we provide tax credit 101, tax credit 201, tax exempt bonds 101 trainings to clients, to public sector partners, and quite often at the SCAMF conference, at the Housing California conference, and other sort of one-off trainings like this. So check out our website if you're interested in more detail.
So Ben, one question that I saw in the chat is when it comes to for developers applying for different funding sources, is there a required order that a developer must get approval of their funding, or can they apply to multiple sources simultaneously? And then, or do some funding sources wait to see what other sources, talk about more of how project managers or developers navigate leveraging the different funding streams. And also, if you want to add in there, someone had a question if how ULA would impact maybe this management of different funding streams.
Tax credits have to be last, pretty much. All other funding sources that I'm aware of, they don't make it an eligibility requirement to have other funds committed, but they almost always make it a sort of points scoring ranking incentive to have had other funds already committed. I mean, this is kind of like the problem of, entry-level position requires 3 years experience. How do you get started? But sooner or later, a development gets its first funding commitment. But no, city, county, state, it's just the tax credits are the last one in. ULA would simply make, from the estimates that I've seen, even the sort of lower, more conservative estimates, it would just be game changing in terms of how much soft funds from the city of LA would be available and on an ongoing basis, as opposed to a one-time basis, which is what we saw from HHH, which has been depleted by now, and projects are coming online, which is fantastic, but there's no more HHH. And so ULA from the affordable housing developer standpoint would just be a much needed, ever since the redevelopment agencies were closed, and I wasn't in the industry at 2012, 2013 or something like that. That was a major source of reliable, ongoing soft funds available, and it largely wasn't replaced. Certainly not that large chunk. So ULA would go a long way for City of LA developments to kick them into high gear and get them ready for construction a lot sooner.
And there's a couple of questions that are just trying to clarify what is the role of the LIHTC investor, the lender. Does that investor get an ownership stake in the project indefinitely? And there was another question that was sort of, where did it go? I can't see that one now, but maybe you can answer that one first.
It's potentially a much longer conversation, but the base case is they and the developer, not usually, like among our clients, the nonprofit developer, the mission-driven developers, usually have an aligned interest in the investor exiting the ownership approximately around year 15. All of the tax credits will have been claimed by year 10 or 11, and the tax benefits that they stand to get will be pretty small at that point. And these are not generating a ton of money from rental income, as we saw. And so in most cases, it's in their mutual interest for the investor to exit in year 15.
All right. Well, it is 2:00, so we're officially at time, but I want to thank Ben and Tony for making time to answer all your questions. I know there are a lot in the Q&A. We have a big audience today, but we will go ahead and share this recording and the slides with everyone who registered. We'll also pass on some additional information to you, as well as Ben's contact info in case you have any follow-up questions. But thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And any last words, Ben or Tony?
Oh, I mean, thanks to Scamp, and thanks to the I can't believe hundreds of people who attended. Really appreciate it. And Tony, it looked like that was a Herculean effort that you did in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you both. And we really appreciate your time. And stay
Thanks.
tuned for more sessions.
Take care.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.